Fear of losing money in trading, the brutal fix you keep dodging. Here is the hook you did not want to hear. Fear is not the problem. Your cozy relationship with it is. You baby it, justify it, and call it natural to excuse the same soft choices. No worries. Right. It is just money. Except it is not. It is time, sacrifice, and attention you never get back. Fear can be useful. But unmanaged fear does not keep you safe. It keeps you small. And small is how accounts bleed while you keep claiming you are being careful. Your first point pats fear on the head and says, relax. Being scared is normal and even good. Comforting. Sure. Also a trap. Knight fear by default, and you hand it a vote on every decision. Shaky hands and a tight chest get rebranded as wisdom instead of what they are, a badly calibrated risk sensor. You lean on the promise that control will come with practice. That sounds noble, and it sounds like stalling while habits harden. Watch the bait and switch. You tell yourself fear protects hard-earned cash. Then, at the first hint of drawdown, that protector whispers safer ideas. Ditch the plan. Chase the bounce. Widen the stop. Or cancel it and call it discretion. The fear you praised puts on a risk manager suit and sells you amateur hour. Maybe the account does not blow up today. Instead, it leaks. Slowly. You rename the leak as learning and hesitation as survival. That is not prudence. That is slow self-sabotage wearing a safety badge. Here is the deeper blind spot in do not worry too much. You start confusing numbness with composure. Composure is reading risk precisely. Numbness is turning down the emotional volume until you cannot hear the signal. With numbness, small tells vanish, the compulsion to peak every minute. The micro-hesitation at the trigger. The fake calm that lasts until a candle rips your line and you bail like paper hands on a pump and dump. Silence is not control. It is just silence. Right up until it becomes panic. Another assumption hides in the cozy wording. You act like fear levels and skill levels will improve together with time. That is wishful thinking. Time is not training. Reps are not progress when the reps are sloppy. You can stare at screens for 1,000 hours and still move a stop with the same shaky logic you had on day one. Fear does not evolve into discipline by itself. It mutates into superstition and rituals, into lucky templates and comfort entries that feel safe because they are familiar, not because they are sound. That is how bag holding gets dressed up as patience and how coping gets marketed as wisdom. Here is the sting. Treat fear as a virtue by default, and you dodge the only scoreboard that matters: risk. Real, measured, position-sized, probabilistically sane risk. Fear, without measurement, collapses into a mood. Moods do not manage trades. Moods manage you. That is why a tiny red candle can feel like the end, and a fat green candle can feel like permission to move your line just this once. You are not trading the market. You are trading your mood swings. No worries, you say, until the mood flips and you get wrecked by your own narrative. So, where does that leave you? Not with a pep talk. With a mirror. The first point wanted you to accept fear like a wise monk with a brokerage login. Reality is harsher. Fear is a warning light, not a steering wheel. Treat it like a steering wheel, and you drift into guardrails softly, repeatedly, predictably. You keep calling that grind experience while your edge erodes one hesitant click at a time. If fear is good, what happens when you pour leverage on top of it and call that efficiency? Part 2. You said trade a small amount with low leverage to avoid risk and let profits show up later. Sounds tidy. Sounds grown up. Also sounds like a velvet cage. The minute you call low leverage a safety blanket, you stop measuring risk and start worshiping a setting. Leverage is a tool, not a behavior. The account does not care if a tool is labeled safe or dangerous. It cares whether position size and volatility are aligned. If size is sloppy, low leverage is lipstick on a pig. Here is the catch you glossed over. People hear low leverage and think low danger. Then they bump size until the dollar risk feels exciting again. So, the supposed safety setting becomes a backdoor for the same thrill. Risk ends up roughly where the impulse always wanted it. You call it conservative because the platform slider says so. The statement still bleeds like you went full throttle. The blind spot is not the leverage number. It is the distance between entry and invalidation, multiplied by size. Without that math, the risk you claim to avoid just hides in a different column. Another problem. Avoiding. Risk is not the same as managing risk. Avoidance breeds hesitation, late entries, and weak conviction. You wait until the move looks obvious because you are trying to duck danger, not price it. Then you buy at exhaustion, sell at relief, and call that patience. Fear loves that loop because it keeps you busy while protecting the illusion of safety. The account calls it slow motion self-damage. You swear the fix is even lower leverage next time. The loop tightens. Let us talk psychology erosion. Trading small can be sharp training. Trading small can also be a sandbox where bad habits grow, undisturbed. With tiny dollars on the line, you experiment with sloppy entries, random exits, and emotional tinkering because the penalty feels painless. Repetition cements behavior. Then, when the size finally ticks up, those same behaviors cling like barnacles, and the emotional shock hits like a truck. The drill never matched the game, and the gap breaks you. No worries. Right. It was only training. Except the market does not honor practice excuses. Here is a quieter leak. Spread and slippage matter. On small size, with tight targets and timid entries, the friction eats the edge, while you tell yourself at least it is safe. Safe from what? Safe from meaningful progress. Honor? The clock still runs. Opportunity cost still compounds. You avoided a blow-up and built a slow bleed instead, then called it discipline. That is not discipline. That is fear dressed as wisdom. You also assume high leverage equals high risk by default. Sometimes. Yes. Often. True. Always. No. Risk lives in the distance to invalidation and the fraction of equity at stake. A wide stop with tiny size and higher leverage can be less fragile than a tight stop with bigger size and lower leverage that gets clipped by noise. When the only knob you touch is leverage, you are playing checkers on a chessboard. The market trades volatility regimes. Your settings pretend every regime is the same. That mismatch is where the quiet losses hide. Notice the language you used. The main goal is to avoid risk. Then, profits arrive when risk is controlled. That posture makes you chase absence of pain instead of presence of edge. When the priority is comfort, comfort dictates timing. Comfort never buys discomfort. Discomfort is where asymmetry lives. So, you end up underexposed to favorable risk and overexposed to emotional noise. You call that maturity. It is just anti-fragility in reverse. Here's the nastier twist. Small size feels safe until a streak of wins trick you into bumping up. Size jumps. Leverage stays low, so you still write safety in your notes. The emotional load, however, just spiked. Now every wiggle stings. Fear amplifies. Decision quality drops. You scale down again, but not before spraying inconsistency across the record. You do not need a guru to label it. The chart of your position size calls it whiplash. So yes, low leverage and small size can help. They can also lull you into thinking the settings are the system. If the mindset still chases comfort and the plan still lacks a hard invalidation, low leverage becomes a permission slip for endless tinkering. That is the irony. In the name of safety, you built a playground where fear writes the rules. And when fear writes the rules, guess what happens to the stop you claim you will never move? Part 3. Now we arrive at the shrine. Set a stop loss at the price you expect. Never move it. Let the trade finish. Sounds clean. Looks disciplined on paper. In practice, it is a false halo that hides where all the slippage of judgment actually happened. The phrase "at the price you expect" is doing heavy lifting with hollow muscles. Expect what? Expectation is not invalidation. Expectation is a mood dressed up as a level. Invalidation is the precise line where your idea is wrong, not where your feelings start to itch. Confuse the two and the stop becomes therapy, not a risk control. Here is the ugly math the slogan skips. A stop placed at a feeling ends up floating near comfort, not structure. Too tight and noise clips you, over and over. And you call the market unfair while gifting spread to the house. Too wide and you convert small errors into bag holding, then pretend you are giving the trade room. A stop without a defined thesis break is not protection. It is a tip jar you keep refilling. Never move it. Nice on a notebook. In the real feed, that line mutates. First, the pre-trade level was guessed from hope, not structure. Then price wobbles. Your hand twitches. You call a tiny nudge flexibility. You call a bigger nudge discretion. And when the bid threatens your line, the story becomes this. The level is still valid, just a bit lower. That is how the alleged rule against moving stops gets bent in silence. The problem is not moving or not moving. The problem is why the stop exists in the first place. If the level was garbage, keeping it fixed is not discipline. It is stubborn cosplay. If the level was sharp, moving it to avoid a loss is not management. It is no loss fantasy. Either way, the account bleeds. Only the narration changes. Let it run until the end. Which end? The end of your patience. The end of your margin. The end of the session when spreads bloom and you get wicked out. The phrase looks decisive and says nothing. End is not a plan. End is an obituary for a trade that died from vague thinking. When the only logic is, let it run. Exits get outsourced to emotion spikes. Green candles make you generous with stops. Red candles make you generous with hope. Both are the same disease wearing different jackets. There is a deeper leak. The rule treats a stop as a single event, not a living estimate of risk as information updates. Fixed stops worship a pre-trade snapshot while the market streams new data every tick. Lock the line blindly and you either cut your losses hard at the worst price because the level sat right on a liquidity magnet, or you sit there frozen while a failed breakout becomes a full-on unwind and you get wrecked like a tourist buying the top of a pump and dump. The world changed. Your line did not. That is not discipline. That is gridlock. Then comes the language tell. Control risk by placing a stop at the price you expect. Control implies measurement. Expect implies guessing. Measurement needs a why. Guessing needs a wish. Parks a stop under a wish, and the next step is inevitable. You start negotiating with yourself. Maybe a few more pips. Maybe the wick was a fake out. Maybe the spread was unusual. The halo around never move, it becomes an excuse to keep the original bad decision, not a guardrail that contains damage. Fear loves that halo. It gets to feel principled while you bleed. Another blind spot sits in execution reality. Stops are not magical teleports. Spread widens. Liquidity thins. Slippage hits. If your entire defense plan is a single line and a prayer, The first gap through that line turns a controlled nick into a cut that needs stitches. The story still says, "I followed the rule." The statement says something else. You did not control risk. You outsourced it to a broker's fill and a market's mood. Calling that risk control is like calling a wish a contract. The psychology knot is the nastiest. A fixed stop without a clear invalidation makes you attach identity to a line. When price creeps near it, you feel judged. Now the decision stops being about asymmetry and becomes about ego. You tighten early to avoid a tiny red on the record. Or you widen late to avoid admitting the idea was trash. Both are the same dodge. You are protecting a story, not capital. No worries, you say. The rule is sound. The rule is not the problem. The vagueness behind it is, if the stop level does not sit on the logic that proves you wrong, the whole thing is theater. And once you see the theater, what happens to that next rule about choosing a method and sticking to it when the method is just a sequence of slogans? Part 4. Choose a method and stick to it. That line sounds like discipline in a bottle. It promises certainty, a shield against panic, a map you can follow in the dark. The harsh reality says something colder. A method with holes is not a map. It is a maze. And loyalty to a maze is not discipline. It is devotion to confusion. Look at the wording. A complete trading system will give rules for patterns, entries, and exits, and a plan you can follow. On paper, that feels tight. In the feed, that is thin. Patterns, entries, exits, those are surface features. Under the surface, live sizing, regime, liquidity, and slippage. Under the surface, live drawdown budgets, time stops, and what happens when spreads bloom at rollover. The naive picture says rules equal reliability. The real picture says a rule without context is a dice roll with better stationery. Contrast the comfort frame with the risk frame. Comfort says a checklist reduces fear. Risk says a checklist without a risk unit is choreography, with no music. Comfort says a plan you can follow makes you calm. Risk says a plan that ignores volatility makes you fragile. Comfort says find a pattern and harvest it. Risk says patterns mutate with regime shifts. And an entry rule that worked yesterday can cut you today. You can be consistent and still consistently wrong. You can follow perfectly and still get wrecked because the method never measured what mattered. There is a quiet sleight of hand in the phrase, choose a method. It suggests methods are interchangeable containers. Plug and play. The market does not care about your container. It cares whether your invalidation sits where the thesis actually fails. Whether your average adverse excursion is smaller than your realized win. Whether your position size respects the distance to that failure line. None of that shows up in the cozy trio of pattern, entry, exit. You can nail all three and still get chewed by noise because the stop sits where feelings feel safe instead of where logic dies. You can tick every box and still leak because the take profit is a fantasy, not a function of structure. Let us expose the shadow corners the slogan avoids. A method that says what to click but not when to stop clicking during a cold streak is not complete. A method that states entry but not how to handle news gaps is not complete. A method that names an exit but says nothing about partials, slippage, or time-based cuts is not complete. A method that talks about patterns but ignores session liquidity is not complete. The naive view treats a rule as a wall. The real view treats rules as hypotheses that require measurement, revision, and sometimes a kill switch. Without that scaffold, stick to it is just a nicer way to say keep repeating the same mistake with extra loyalty. Here is the bitter symmetry. The earlier advice leaned on fear as a virtue and stops as holiness. This one leans on method compliance as salvation, Fear made you hesitant. Stops made you stubborn at the wrong level. Method loyalty now makes you rigid. Hesitation, stubbornness, rigidity. Different doors. Same room. The room where comfort writes the playbook and the account pays the ticket. The chart does not grant refunds when the show is bad. Now weigh the marketing against the mechanics. The text promises a plan you can follow. The market demands a plan that survives slippage, drift, and regime change. The text hints at a tidy sequence, recognize a pattern, enter at a signal, exit at a rule. The market runs on messier math, distribution tails, variance, sequences of losers that arrive in bursts, and fills that slip when you need them most. The naive picture claims clarity. The real picture requires tolerating uncertainty with precision about what is allowed to vary and what is not. A generic method tries to freeze the world. The world moves anyway. There is also the identity trap. Choose a method sounds like choose a tribe. Once the label lands, every deviation feels like betrayal, and every red feels like a verdict on you, not the process. That is how review turns into defense and learning turns into litigating, why the method still works if you squint. The method becomes a partner you defend, not a tool you evaluate. The account does not care about your vows. It cares about your expectancy, your dispersion, and whether your worst day stays inside a boundary. None of that shows up when the headline victory is, "I stuck" to the plan while the plan leaked on contact. So the contrast is clear. Naive thinking declares a plan complete because it names a few visible parts. Harsh reality demands the invisible parts be spelled out first, because those are the parts that bleed when the tape goes crooked, bet size anchored to invalidation, drawdown circuit breakers, time-based exits when nothing happens, and a regime lens that explains when to throttle exposure and when to sit on hands. Without the invisible scaffold, stick to it becomes a loyalty oath to a half-built bridge. Walk far enough on a half-built bridge and gravity gives the feedback. Call it unfair if that helps you sleep. The statement will still read the same in the morning. And when morning comes, what happens to that final promise about controlling psychology if the method you cling to keeps manufacturing situations that weaponize your fear and your rigidity? Part 5. Control your psychology. You said, the line reads like a magic lever. Pull it, and the fear shrinks. The hand stops shaking. The mind goes zen on command. That is the fantasy. The market does not respond to vibes. Psychology is not a switch you flip. It is the exhaust smoke from the engine under, the hood. Change the combustion, and the smoke changes. Keep the same leaky engine and chant calm all day. The smoke stays dirty. The earlier advice made fear a virtue. Leverage a pacifier. It stops a halo. And method loyalty a badge. No wonder psychology ends up framed like mood management. You try to breathe your way through structural mistakes. That is backwards. Mood spikes are not random thunder. They are alarms telling you the build lacks scaffolding. You feel jumpy because size is unmoored from invalidation. You feel desperate because the stop location is emotional, not structural. You feel rigid because the so-called complete system ignores regime, slippage, and drawdown budgets. The mind is not broken. The build is. Fix the build and the mind calms as a side effect. Keep patching the mind and the build keeps biting. A sharper frame looks like this. Psychology becomes an output variable of risk math, execution design, and review hygiene. Risk math lives in a single risk unit that everything references, not a feeling. Size maps to the distance between entry and the precise failure line, not to comfort. Drawdown has a budget and a circuit breaker, not a prayer and a pep talk. Time is part of risk. A trade that goes nowhere for too long starts costing edge. Exits, respect that clock. When this skeleton is present, the heart rate stops dictating the next click. You are not fighting yourself. You are following physics. Execution design removes room for mid-trade negotiation, the exact place where fear loves to bargain. Entries trigger from thesis and structure, not from FOMO dressed as confirmation. Stops sit at thesis death, not at itch distance. Profit-taking is mechanical enough to starve greed of improvisation, but flexible enough to respect fresh information. Partial exits are defined before the first fill, not invented mid-tilt. None of this is hero talk. It is anti-drama engineering. Once the path is narrow, emotions can be loud and still irrelevant. Loud does not equal in control. Review hygiene is the pressure washer that keeps delusion from caking on. Logs capture maximum adverse excursion and maximum favorable excursion, not just win or loss. Expectancy is tracked, not hoped. Sequences are mapped so the mind expects clusters of losers instead of panicking when variance behaves like variance. The chart of your behavior becomes a mirror, not a diary of excuses. That mirror kills superstition, which is fear's favorite ally. When the numbers tell you where the leak lives, the inner monologue stops inventing monsters. Here is the pivot that hurts. Control your psychology reads like a noble aim. In practice, it often becomes code for suppress the symptom and ignore the cause. You tell yourself to stay calm while the size is wrong. The stop is therapy. The plan is vague, and the method is allergic to regime change. Calm turns into numb. Numb turns into late entries and early exits. The statement still says control. The account still says bleed. A different posture replaces that spiral. Treat discomfort as a routing signal, not an enemy. When discomfort spikes, it routes you to the checklist that inspects sizing, invalidation, and whether the current volatility regime even belongs to your playbook. The outcome is not because calm arrived. The outcome is because the structure forced clarity. There is irony you might not enjoy. The pursuit of calm directly is what keeps you on tilt. The pursuit of clarity produces calm as a byproduct. Clarity is born from constraints. Constraints are born from measurement. Measurement is born from the willingness to be humbled by your own record. That humility is not soft. It is the only steel that does not rust in a storm. You can talk about mindset all day, or you can build a track where the right behavior is the path of least resistance and the wrong behavior has nowhere to hide. One sounds inspiring. One actually moves the needle. So yes, control your psychology, but not by staring at candles and breathing like a monk while the plan leaks. Control shows up when risk is denominated, when invalidation is non-negotiable, when the method adapts across regimes without becoming a new religion every week, and when review burns away narrative until only data remains. That is the escape route through the wreckage the earlier points created. The moment that route is visible, a question bites harder than any pep talk. If psychology is the exhaust, what happens to fear when the engine finally stops leaking and the next rule you live by is built to survive contact instead of performing discipline for your notes? Part 6. When the engine stops leaking, the smoke clears. Fear stops pretending to be wisdom and goes back to being a signal. Leverage goes back to being a tool, not a pacifier. Stops return to their job as a fail line, not a shrine. Method becomes scaffolding, not an identity. Psychology becomes the exhaust, not the steering wheel. That is the harmony the earlier points accidentally obscured. Not a sermon, just gravity. Layer the pieces in the only order that holds under heat. First, the thesis defines where it dies, not where comfort begins to itch. Where it dies, That line births position size, not the other way around. Size anchors to distance to failure and the fraction of equity acceptable to lose on a single idea, not to vibes, not to platform sliders, not to last night's P&L, with size chained to invalidation. Leverage settings, stop being morality plays, and revert to plumbing. Now, the stop is not a hope bookmark. It is the final boundary that enforces the math you already accepted before a single click. Psychology, stripped of excuses, has less to negotiate with. Fear can scream. The plan does not move. Next layer, regime. The naive script pretended patterns stand outside weather. They do not. Volatility expands and contracts. Liquidity thins and thickens. Spreads bloom and vanish. Without a regime lens, a so-called complete system is just choreography drawn on ice that keeps melting underneath your skates. Add regime and the same rules route to different exposure. Throttle down when noise dominates. Throttle up when structure carries signal. Sit out when the market speaks in static. That is not flipping beliefs. That is refusing to confuse stubbornness for strength. Then comes execution nuance that keeps fear on the bench. Triggers tie to structure, not adrenaline. Partial exits are pre-computed, not improvised. Time stops exist, so the cost of nothing. Happening stops quietly, draining edge. Review feeds back into sizing and scheduling, not into superstition and skin-of-the-teeth tinkering. You do not hunt calm. You build constraints that produce calm as a side effect. The mind stops shadowboxing because there is nothing left to argue about mid-trade. The fun part is how boring the tape feels when the build is right. Boring is where accounts grow while the loud crowd keeps looking for fireworks and collecting burns. Look back at the original 5 points through this sharper lens. Fear acknowledged as natural becomes fear audited as information. Small size and low. Leverage as a blanket become risk units tied to invalidation, with size changing only when the math says so, not when excitement spikes. A stop placed at expectation morphs into a stop placed at thesis death, defended by rules that do not allow late-night negotiations. Choose a method and stick to it evolves into choose a method that specifies invisible parts first and sticks to reality, not to a label. Control. Your psychology transforms from mood control to structural clarity. Less incense, more instrumentation. Each point salvaged, none of the comforting illusions left intact. Here is the bitter symmetry that ties the knot. Every soft version of those rules aim to avoid pain. Every hard version aims to price it. Avoidance hoards discomfort until it erupts at the worst moment. Pricing discomfort distributes it in controlled pieces you can swallow without choking. That is the difference between getting wrecked by a single gap and taking a nick you already budgeted when the world lurches. One life is drama. The other is arithmetic. One life needs pep talks. The other reads the ledger and gets on with it. There is no dogma here. Only a dare. Not the noisy kind. The quiet dare to let numbers outrank, narrative. To let the failure line dictate size. To let regime define when your so-called edge even deserves capital today. Call it harsh. The statement will call it solvent. The market will not clap. It will just stop punishing the same soft habits. And that is the brutal fix you kept dodging. Replace comfort theater with risk physics, and fear loses its script. If this hit home, share it with your buddies who keep confusing discipline with rituals that leak on contact. Subscribe to Mind Over Markets so you do not miss the next razor-sharp breakdown that turns cozy myths into operating rules. The account does not need inspiration. It needs fewer holes. You know which ones we just exposed.